spring. Is everyone getting vaccinated? This evening, we are asking the flight attendant to bring your favorite drink and fastening our seatbelts as we journey back in time when flying was fun. Julia Cooke's book, Come Fly the World, has glamour, danger, and liberation in a madman era of commercial flight. Am World Airways attracted the kind of woman who wanted out and wanted up. Stewardesses, now known as flight attendants, serving on Pan Am between 1966 and 1975 were required to have a college education, speak 2 languages, and possess the political savvy of a foreign service officer. Not only that, but a jet-age stewardess also had to be between 5'3" and 5'9", 105 to 140 pounds, and under 26 years of age. So with a nod to a bygone era, I am toasting these iconic women with a classic airline drink, a Bloody Mary. What is everyone else drinking?
I have a glass of rosé.
I have orange wine.
Yum. It feels very spring-like.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Wine.
Oh, we can't vote.
No.
I
want to see what other people are drinking.
It would be a good time.
Do we get to see the results?
Sure.
I could go for a gin and tonic. That looked good. It's read well.
I know. We'll look at our options here.
All right.
Okay.
Wine. Okay, wine it is.
Wine.
And then gin and tonic.
Then gin and tonic, because it's so nice out.
Yep.
Great.
It is. It's beautiful. So we're here tonight with Julia Cooke and Ann Hood. Julia Cooke is a journalist and a travel writer whose features and personal essays have been published in Time, Smithsonian, Condé Nast, and Saveur. She is the author of The Other Side of Paradise, Life in the New Cuba. The daughter of a former Pan Am executive, Cooke grew up in a Pan Am family, a still strong network around the globe, and she lives in Woodstock, Vermont. Ann Hood is the editor of Knitting Yarns, Writers on Knitting, and the best-selling author of The Book That Matters Most, The Knitting Circle, The Red Thread, Comfort, and An Italian Wife, among other works. She is the recipient of many awards, including a Best American Travel Writing Award, and she lives in Providence, Rhode Island. If you have questions for either of the authors, enter them into the Q&A screen on the Q&A window on your screen, and you can also upvote the questions already asked, and I will facilitate that as soon as we hear from our presenters. Welcome, Kate, and welcome Kate. Welcome, Ann. Sorry. Welcome, Julia, and welcome, Ann.
Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Julia, it's nice to meet you. You know, in a way, even though you seem very nice, we are rivals, Pan Am and TWA, who I flew whenever I meet a former Pan Am flight attendant, we immediately get into which airline was better. So I know where you fall on that. What was it like growing up in a Pan Am family?
You know, it was a great and bizarre way to grow up. You know, so my dad wasn't a pilot. He was in the Pan Am building. He was an attorney. And, you know, it was really my mom who was just 100% determined to reap as much, you know, to squeeze every bit of travel out of the travel benefits. So she traveled with me and my sister a ton. I have a little sister who's 3 years younger than me. And she tells me that my first flight was when I was like 2 months old, and, you know, she would pack us for either hot or cold, and we would go to the airport and see where, you know, where there were 2 to 4 free seats, depending on how many of us there were. So it was a really, you know, it was very fly by the seat of your pants, very spontaneous. But we traveled almost every long weekend or anything. How about you?
It's funny, my TWA roommate, Diane, who I'm still very good friends with, texted me just a few days ago and said, what was it called when we'd get the free seats? And I said,
Yeah.
not having. It was, oh, that's right. I couldn't remember what we called it. Yeah, I did a lot of that myself, and my parents were completely game to join me. They would come to my apartment in New York, and I was on reserve at Kennedy on International. And wherever I got called, they just come with me to the airport and get on the plane if they could.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So we were so lucky. So for people who don't know, can you describe what we're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you mean in terms of like standby?
Yeah, and the free tickets. And
Oh yeah, no, airline families, you get benefits like for the women that so it was different depending on whether you were a flight attendant or a stewardess, or if you were in the executive wing.
Yep.
There were different kinds of access.
Pilot,
but
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There were, the different sorts of employees had different types of access and could extend the benefits to different members of their families. One really interesting, it's so funny because a lot of the women that I'm profiling in my book began flying in like the 60s. All of them began flying in the 60s from between 66. Well, actually, one started flying in the 50s, and her parents were absolutely appalled. Her mother did not want her to be a stewardess. She had believed all of the negative connotations about the job. And really what convinced her was that Claire was able to extend her travel benefits to her mom. And her sister. And so as soon as Claire's mom and sister started being able to do exactly what you're describing, just hop on the planes with her and got to see all of the different places that she was seeing and meet all of the different women that she was flying with,
right.
She met these women who were just as serious and smart and ambitious as her daughter was. And so she was like, okay, fine. You knew what you were doing.
It's okay. It's bad because, well, I can't really say anything about it for this past year, but one of my dearest friends who I flew with at TWA works for American, who's worked for them for many years, and he's unmarried, so I get his passes, and I
nice.
get them, but it's not like it used to be. Flights are full all the time.
Yeah.
So when I got stuck in India with my 12-year-old son one time, I was like, this is too dicey. It used to be easier.
Yeah. Yeah, the one thing, so I have been to, in the research for this book, I spent a lot of time obviously with former stewardesses from all over, and I went to one of the main ways that I contacted them, that I met the women that I wanted to interview, was by going to the conventions that former Pan Am stewardesses have around the world. And I like to imagine all of the different the different ways that they get there and then the ways that they leave. And I heard that they would all meet at 5 o'clock in the morning on the days after the convention, because they all said that early morning flights were the only time that you can get standby seats anymore, because there's always a couple of partiers, especially in places like Paris or Bangkok, or the places that have great nightlife. You can always get a seat on like the 5, 6, 7 a.m. flights, but you can't really get, the afternoon ones. Everyone shows up for those.
You don't want to wake up that early.
Exactly.
I wonder, is this a book like you always wanted to write, or?
It's not. So I came at this subject completely accidentally. I say it completely accidentally, even though my dad worked for the airline. I honestly had not thought very much about the airline, other than, the kind of the family anecdotes that you tell around the dinner table after a glass of wine. We talked about Pan Am like that, but we didn't talk about it in terms of any intellectual interest or anything like that. It was not like a subject that I had always wanted to write about. What happened was I went to an event that was held at the TWA terminal in New York, which you must have been flying out of. Yep. I can't imagine a better place to be flying in and out of.
Dreamy.
It's so beautiful.
Dreamy, absolutely.
It's absolutely gorgeous. So I had always wanted to tour it, but it was closed to the public back then, like 7 years ago. So the Pan Am Historical Foundation was hosting an event there to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' arrival in the US. And I went, and I just wound up talking to these two former stewardesses who were so smart. They were really, they were sarcastic and funny, and really they talked about geopolitics and international history with this level of intimacy and, real knowledge that I found just completely appealing. And then one of them, I had driven out to the terminal, and I offered her a ride back home, back into Manhattan. And I said, "Oh, I mean, how did you get out here? Did you buy a train ticket for, the way back?" And she said, "Oh no, darling, I never buy a return ticket. You never know what's going to happen wherever you're going."
Love it. That's true.
And I was like, I need to know everything about you.
Interesting. When was that, Julia?
That was 7 years ago.
Okay. And then you spent some time
Yeah.
and talking to flight attendants, or they were stewardesses probably.
Yeah, they corrected me actually.
Yeah.
I had initially called them flight attendants, and then they were like, "Oh no, we were stewardesses."
Yeah. It's funny because I'm on some Facebook groups, and one is, "Oh, stewardess." I don't know, maybe you also investigated these. "Oh, stewardess." Somebody said, "I'm so angry that no one says stewardess anymore. I was a stewardess." And there were like 200 comments, of which maybe 5 were, "No, we worked to become flight attendant. We worked for this." But the other 195 were like, "I love being a stewardess. That's what it's funny." But
it's so interesting.
Yeah. Whereas if I was called a stewardess, I always was like, "No, I'm a flight attendant." So it depends on when you flew, I think.
Exactly. That's exactly what my interpretation of it was. I think it really, for the women who started in the 60s, it was a very different job in like the early 60s, mid 60s. And you're right. Like the women who were flying who fought so hard to keep their jobs and to redefine the parameters of the job, legally, they worked really hard to be flight attendants, to get that name change,
right,
and everything that it implied. But for the women who started and who had flown under the restrictions of the 60s, and had worked for those changes at the very, very beginning, they feel like the name pegs them to what they really did and the parameters that they were laboring within.
Yeah, it makes sense. So Julia, I don't know if you know this. It's Sandy. I don't even know if you know this, but I have a book coming out next spring called Fly Girl, about my days as a TWA
Awesome.
attendant. And so I've been thinking about this a lot more than I had, in writing it. And I would love to hear what the women said about like the weigh-ins and all of those restrictions that were still in place when I started in 1978.
So you started in 1978. So I want to hear in turn about what it was like for you starting in that era, because that's an era that I didn't study necessarily. My book traces 1966 to 75, and like I said, one of the women had begun flying in 56. So I had a lot of information from 56 on as well. But I have not nothing. I don't have that much knowledge about the post 70s, but they really took it in stride. Like a lot of them, they kind of assumed it was part of what they had signed up to do. Right. So they didn't really think that, they didn't find it inappropriate necessarily. They found it uncomfortable, and they dreaded it on some level.
Yeah.
But most of them didn't really find it too onerous. And Pan Am, it's worth saying, was a little more relaxed about its restrictions like that, in terms of it tended to value intellect, I think, a lot. So the statistic that's in the book that a bunch of reviewers have really clicked into is that in the 60s, when 6 to 8% of American women graduated from college, period, 10% of the women on Pan Am had graduate degrees.
Wow.
So they were hiring a really, ambitious group of women for whom flying was fulfilling something, that was other than what they were qualified to do.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that most of the women you talked to, well, not most, but probably many of them, had to quit if they got married.
Yeah, and they did. A lot of them hid their marriages at first, and a lot of them, some of them didn't really want to keep flying after they got married. It just, the women who are the central figures in my book actually got married after that rule had been done away with, because they were part of the generation of women that brought lawsuits in order to be able to get married.
right. And pregnancy as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to be so jealous of your answer. I already know, but you probably have tons of things. I brought all these props to show it. This is like a first class TWA glass.
Yes.
France. And it's got the little plane on the back of my husband.
Oh my God.
Like the whole set. Like we have Greece and Rome. And is your house where you grew up just filled with all that stuff?
It's not.
What?
It's totally not. No.
Wow.
It's crazy. My parents didn't, they're not huge collectors of things like that, which is, I'm sorry. This is, yeah. They're not huge collectors of memorabilia. They have, my dad collected a lot of planes. So we have little planes, which is not really that interesting to me.
Right.
Of course, he collected the things that I don't care about.
Right.
So
they had such beautiful stuff, especially TWA and Pan Am. They really had top notch.
They invested so much in the appearance, and it's so interesting because that has been so enduring. Like in the last couple of years, there have been a couple of books that have come out about, graphic design and, physical design, like the industrial design and fashion around the jet age. It was really like, it paid off.
One of my favorite things, and I want to talk more about the women in your book, and I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit superficial right now, but one of my favorite things is flight attendant uniforms. Because
I don't think that's superficial. I have to say, after doing all the reading, sorry to interrupt you, but I don't think that's superficial.
Well, it tells such a story of history.
It does.
Women and cultural history as well. So if they flew from 56 to 74 or 5, what were their uniforms like?
So the ones in 1950, it traces a real arc of like the cultural changes that were happening in the era. In the 50s, they were very chaste, a little bit feminine, but buttoned up, very professional. Mm-hmm. And then in the 60s, the lines were really mirroring like Madison Avenue lines. They were a little starched. Which the women really appreciated, especially because on other airlines, they were starting to really raise the hemlines and get a little racier, tighter. They were starting to wear knits instead of wool. Mm-hmm. Like even, on Braniff had its Poochie uniforms and Southwest.
They were great though.
Yeah.
I have to say, I love looking at old flight attendant uniforms, and those Braniff ones, the Poochie ones, were crazy.
Some of them are gorgeous.
They're gorgeous.
They're beautiful. Well, and the reason why, my conclusion, the reason why I say that I don't think it's superficial at all is that I think it really ties into the sociocultural changes that were happening in the era. Like it offers such a vista on what was happening. And, the women that I've talked to really had strong feelings about what they were wearing in terms of how it empowered them.
Yes.
Especially on Pan Am, which always had the most conservative uniforms because they were flying like exclusively internationally. And if you think about it, the sexual revolution was not really happening the same way in every corner of the globe. Right. So that they had to err on the side of, keep the hemlines respectable and keep the jackets, pretty neat. So, the women really appreciated that. They really found it, they felt like it elevated what they did. And it really, exactly, it gave them a sense of professionalism. Mm-hmm. And especially on, a lot of my book talks about the war flights into Vietnam for the Vietnam War, especially in an overtly dangerous context. What you wear, fashion has power. Mm-hmm. And, it really, to them, it put them on more of an even footing with the soldiers who were in uniform.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I know Pan Am was very big in Vietnam. I mean, in flying soldiers. And I suppose the women you talked to were involved in that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the major themes of the book is the Vietnam War flights. mostly because I felt like it really, or I came to see that it really encapsulated, my theory that international stewardesses were more diplomats. They were basically implementing what we now call public diplomacy or soft power in an era in which that was not yet really fully understood.
Yeah.
And so, they were filling this kind of in-between role.
So how many women did you cover or follow?
So the book centers on 5 women. There's Tori, Lynn, and Karen, who all flew on the Operation Baby Lift flight out of Vietnam at the end of the war. And then there are 2 other women, Claire and Hazel. Claire Claire I found fascinating because she's the one who flew from 1956 onward, and she fought tooth and nail to get a job in management, and she succeeded. So she had a 30-year career with the airline. Most of it was she was one of the first cohort of women that were promoted from stewardessing into management roles, supervisory and then management. And then Hazel, who is she's African American. She's from Minnesota, and she was among the first big cohort of Black stewardesses on the airline, who were all hired after the EEOC basically said, "Get your act together," to the airlines, and said, you can't, this overt racism thing that you're doing in only hiring young white women, no longer. So
what year was that? Do you remember, Julia?
So the lawsuits were happening all over the course of the 60s. The EEOC was in 64, but they didn't really start hiring a lot of women until the very late 60s, like 69, 70.
Yeah, I know it's a terrible story, but TWA didn't hire a Black applicant, and it was early. It was way earlier. It was
all of them didn't. They were all, for my research, I read some of the hiring memos, and it's disgusting.
It's terrible, but she went and Republic hired her even that early. I can't remember her name, unfortunately, but she was the first Black attendant or stewardess. But
I think I just posted her name. I know her name. She was on the cover of Ebony.
Yeah, she was
in 62.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it took a while for everybody to catch up. Well, we're still catching up, but
well, those women wound up suing TWA and Northwest and Pan Am and winning.
Right.
So they really paved the way.
Yeah, I'm going to move because I see that I have. I'm just going to swing I see the sun is doing a weird, daylight savings time. That was nice. Okay, now I'm over here. Okay. So what was your favorite story that you heard? That's hard because you heard so many good ones. I don't like questions like that, but.
Oh God, yeah, I don't even know.
Heard that.
I mean, there was a lot that, it's not my favorite, but one of the things that fascinated me was flying into Cold War Moscow. Pan Am had these flights that started in 68 that were really seen as being really essential to the U.S. Cold War effort. The concept of LBJ called it one small gain, that peace, world peace was not going to be earned with one big gesture. It was going to be small gains. And this was, these new Pan Am flights in 68 were one of these small gains. So these women, it's so weird because we think about, public diplomacy and these steps, these corporations toward the national interest, but we don't think about the fact that, there were women crewing each one of these flights, and they had layovers in Cold War Moscow. And so, while the rest of the US was still, thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis was only, a couple years in the rear view. So the rest of the US was not thinking about tourism in Moscow. And in the late 60s, these women were like, sign me up, let's go to Russia. So they were in their stories are fascinating. And, I heard stories about.
Where did they stay? Were there state-run hotels?
Yeah, there were state-run hotels. There was one hotel called Intourist that they stayed at. They were not getting put up at the the Metropole or anything. So, but they have these amazing stories about playing Shake the KGB and how they would go into they would measure the distance between hotel doors, and then measured the distance on the inside of the room. And they noticed that there were 3 feet of unaccounted for space where they assumed that they were being spied on.
Totally.
So but I just love the idea of these women, taking out their measuring tapes and measuring the distance between the door. It just is. So, and Hazel was Hazel wound up flying a ton of these flights. So it was really, and it was fascinating.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so were they still flying when Pan Am folded, or had they stopped already?
A couple of them were. Hazel was. Tori wound up flying. Tori, another one of the women that I profiled, wound up flying for 45, almost 50 years. And she was the one who wanted to actually be a diplomat, but realized that they weren't going to hire a woman without a master's or a PhD. She needed a job right out of college. And she also didn't want again, tidbits that you learn in research. I had not known that all around the world, women used to have to quit the formal diplomatic corps if they got married, because then their allegiances were going to be split between husband and country. Whereas a man, if he got married, he would just gain another diplomat in his wife. So she had wanted to go into diplomacy, but had not, she couldn't, she wasn't going to do it. So she was just going to fly for 2 years to travel a little bit. And fast forward 50 years. How long did you fly for?
I flew for 8.
It's a long time.
It's like nothing compared to 50 years.
No, but so when you started flying, did you think about it in terms of, a job for a year or two, or what was your?
I didn't think I wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
So I just thought I'll get experiences and travel and have fun, but I never thought an end date to it, And I had sold my first novel and I still was flying, and I probably would have kept flying longer, but TWA had that big labor strike in 1986, and all the flight attendants were basically fired and replaced. And by the time we won our labor suit, I had 2 books published, and I really thought about going back. I thought about it seriously. It was 3 years later, maybe. But I was like, but then how would I do a book tour, and how would I write my books? And I just couldn't see the 2 careers meshing or melding. I would have flown longer. I loved it.
But at the beginning, that's the thing. So Karen, one of the women in the book, really wanted to be a writer and be a journalist as well. And she used to, she would, the more I thought about it from her perspective, it is the perfect job for, still to this day, for someone who wants to be a writer. It's a stable paycheck. You get exposure to so many different kinds of people.
Right.
Your ear for dialogue must be incredible with all the overhearing and eavesdropping you can do in the air.
I did notice when my first few novels came out that reviews always pointed out the dialogue was good. And I thought, because I sat on that jump seat and just listened, people's voices.
Of course. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have some funny things here, which I thought you might enjoy, Julia, but here's me in my uniform.
That's awesome.
So that's probably 70. That's probably 1980, actually, or 79 after I stopped for a while. And here's my diploma, which we all look
I love it.
Which one I am. No, I do. But
I love it.
Yeah. We had that military style uniform also.
Yeah.
This is fast. My cousin said, I just mailed you something that I found in a box of stuff. And it's my name tag.
It's awesome.
I know. I love it. So
that's so great.
A pile of stuff. Yeah.
What were your favorite? Well,
no, go ahead.
I have What were your favorite routes?
I liked New York, Cairo. That was my favorite. Or New York, Athens. And domestic, I like to go to San Francisco because I love that city. I never was a fan, and Pan Am didn't have this, but TWA was unique in that it had short haul and long haul flights. And so you were either international or domestic. And when you started, you were typically a domestic. And I never liked those Pittsburgh, Columbus, whatever, back to Pittsburgh, 5 little. So I liked the long haul, but not everybody was like that. I mean, I had friends who liked turnarounds, who liked to go, go Boston, Las Vegas, and they're home at night. But
Yeah.
I was more of a long haul flight
So
attendant.
were the women that I interviewed. I mean, Pan Am only did long haul,
Yes,
really.
right.
So, that they didn't really have much of a choice.
It's interesting because I've always thought about this with Pan Am, and I've talked to my friend who flew for them about it, but they really saw the Middle East change.
Yeah, they absolutely did. And they had I heard from a lot of women, they felt very keenly what was happening in Beirut later in the 70s, because they had loved, especially like the War of the Hotels, which happened from the hotels that they had all had their layovers at.
Oh my God.
So they just watched on TV and the Beirut, the Phoenicia Intercontinental in Beirut was so many people's favorite hotels because, again, these like superficial things, which I think are not that superficial. They're, on a superficial level, it's because Brigitte Bardot and Frank Sinatra and Omar Sharif, they all loved this hotel, and so they stayed at it. Beirut was the Paris of the region, and it was a very hot city back then. But I think on a not so superficial level, what I heard from them over and over again was that they treated us just like every other customer. So when else in your life are you going to get the same exact treatment as Frank Sinatra? And what does that mean to you as a young woman in your early 20s to have that level of dignified treatment and, that sense of importance? Like, how transformative is that to your sense of self?
Oh, it must have been so sad to watch it all fall apart.
Totally.
Yeah. Beirut, I've never been, but have you ever been?
I've never been. I'm dying to go.
I am too. I understand, and I've seen, from pictures and articles how beautiful it was. And maybe it'll come back. Maybe it is coming back. I don't know. But I remember that they flew to Jordan also, as I remember. So many places that have just changed politically and safety wise.
Yes.
They were able to see. I am sure they flew into Baghdad.
They did. Well, they also, it's so interesting. A lot of them would tell me stories about Tehran in particular, and all of these different, tons of different places.
Yeah.
It must be, and again, I'm in my late 30s now, so I have some hindsight when it comes to my own travels, but I can't imagine, being in your 60s and 70s and thinking about the ways that you behaved in a different time and place in your life, in a place that is so different on a geopolitical level now than it was back then. Just the sense of change, both, micro and macro. It's fascinating.
It's one of the things that's fascinating to me about the job of flight attendant or stewardess, and the history of aviation, is that it so mirrors what was happening in the world. And I find that so fascinating that that stewardesses were expected to be a certain way because that's how women had to be, but they were elevated because they were the lucky women who had these jobs, and then how that just grew and changed as politics and cultural stuff changed. And I know that's what your book explores, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because what I really wanted to do, so I met these women and I found them fascinating. And then I started looking up like what other people had written about being a stewardess in the era. And the first thing I noticed was that, there were a lot of mentions. Gail Collins has a great section on dusty roads and the lawsuits from the 1960s and 70s and the ways that stewardesses contributed to the feminist movement in her book, When Everything Changed.
Yeah.
But she's got 4 or 5 pages on it, and it works really well within the context of what she's trying to do, which is an overview of the feminist movement in America in that era. But it didn't really, what struck me was that I wasn't finding anything that wrote about what they experienced. Like, what was it like to do the kind of travel that they were doing, and how did it change them? And how did, what did they love about it? What did they find challenging about it? What did their parents think about it? All of these different things. Because if they were going to fight so hard for this job, it was for a reason. If they, so that was what that's what my book is mostly trying to do.
Yeah. I mean, it is in a way, also the story of the women's movement.
It is.
Behind the scenes in a way. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. So I was hired in 1978, and it was harder to get a job with to be a TWA flight attendant, hired as one, than it was to get into Harvard.
Totally.
And people don't realize.
No, they don't. Pan Am hired 3% of applicants.
Mm-hmm.
It's insane.
Yeah.
I mean, and it must have been even harder when you were applying, because that was when, so in the early 60s, there was a lot of turnover because of the marriage rules, because you had to quit when you were married or 35.
Right.
And then as these lawsuits wrapped up and women were, had succeeded in proving that there was no actual necessity that they do that, it was just bald sexism.
Oh my God.
Then the numbers of tenure ticked up and up and up every year. I think one year, I have the actual number in the book, but one year it was like 2 years was the average tenure, and then 2 years later it was 7 years.
Oh yeah.
So no one was quitting. You must have been insanely qualified to get the job.
When I flew international, I was on reserve almost the entire time, because people, I was like the most junior person with like 5 years.
Yeah.
And the next most junior person had like 25 years.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous,
Yeah.
I was like, never gonna hold those dream
Yeah.
rates, That's okay. That was fun too. So did they have stories about like all living together? And
they did. So Tori, the woman who wanted to be a diplomat, she lived in an apartment, her first apartment in New York. There were, I think, there were 5 women in a 1-bedroom apartment with 3 beds, but because they were all away, they were all stewardesses. And so there were never more than 3 people in the apartment at any given time.
Oh, how funny. That's
and
cool.
Isn't it? And then the other, the upside of the deeply sexist weight checks and requirements therein was that they all got to share dresses, because they were all more or less the same dress size. Yeah. So they didn't have to, the job didn't exactly pay a ton in the late 60s.
Yes.
But the perks were huge, and they were able to stretch their money pretty far.
Yeah. I love those stories. I have a friend who flew for TWA in the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And she tells stories about like going out to dinner with King Farouk, and go to the Copacabana, and all the stewardesses living together in New York, of course.
Yep.
And I always make her tell me those stories. It's so engaging, and they're so charming and such good storytellers.
They are. Because if you think about it, what the uniqueness of the kind of the qualifications of the job, they had to be extroverted, engaged people pleasers who were able to think on their feet.
Yep.
They also had to be linguistically gifted, because they had to speak 2 languages in order to fly on Pan Am. Mm-hmm. And they had to have college educations. Yeah. So like that combination of qualities, a lot of them went on to become, there are a couple of women that I've heard of who went on to become therapists, or went into actual formal diplomacy, or into international business. Mm-hmm. Those qualifications are it's a unique skill set.
Yeah, and it makes that package is interesting. I mean, of the person
totally
has all those things.
Yeah.
Did these 5 women know each other?
They didn't. So 3 of them had flown on the same Operation Baby Lift flight, so they knew each other casually, but they weren't exactly friends. Some of the stewardesses obviously, forged these lifelong friendships, mm-hmm. but it wasn't on a crew basis necessarily. They weren't like, because they were all bidding flights based on such a complicated matrix of where they wanted to go, or what their schedules were like, or whatever. Right. So, they were all friendly with one another, and those 3 women remembered one another. But they had not stayed in touch.
How many did you talk to before you narrowed it down to these 5?
A lot.
A lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I knew there were a couple of, so my initial focus was on the Vietnam War. But the more I learned, the more I understood that there were a couple of other stories that I wanted to be able to tell. If I was going to tell the story of the women who worked on the airline in that era, I also needed to talk about, women getting into management and the racial diversification of the airline. And then also I really wanted to talk about the Russia flights, the Moscow flights.
Fascinating.
And it was, and so I was lucky enough to find 2 women that had those 3.
Okay.
So.
And how did you find them at all? Like, I know how you met the one.
There's an international, so there's a group called World Wings International, which is the association of former flight crew on Pan Am.
Yep.
And they're very active. They have a lot of, the different chapters have luncheons in different cities. They really have a good time together.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's good to reminisce. And now I heard a rumor that Pan Am is starting up again. Have you heard that rumor?
I've heard that rumor. There's always something starting up again
Yeah.
somewhere. And the different airlines, there's always like a different, like it's a regional airline. I think the one that I heard of most recently is like a regional Florida airline.
Oh, using the name Pan Am?
Yeah, something like that.
And I went to Havana a few years ago and it was Eastern Airlines. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah, they're using all the old names.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think this is all you will write about Pan Am, or did something else strike you in doing this research?
No, I mean, I think there are, I think it's all that I will write about Pan Am, but I know that there are many other books to be written about Pan Am. I'm just not the person to write it. There needs to be a more in-depth book written by a woman of color about the experience of women of color on Pan Am in particular.
Right.
There's a great book written by a former Delta flight attendant, which talks about Black Americans in aviation in general, and it's much broader and it's great. But I would love to read a book written by maybe a Black travel writer about that particular, the specificity of that experience from a vantage point that is not mine. And then, there are a couple of other, there was an academic book that came out last year about Pan Am's culinary, like the foods on it.
One of my favorite things is the food.
Yes. Yeah.
I have food and uniforms. That's where I am. But
yeah,
I remember every first class meal that I had to prepare.
Do you?
Because I loved them all. And I thought they were so sophisticated and glamorous, and I was so proud to serve them.
Yes,
our Royal Ambassador Service, it was called, and so I think the food is fabulous.
Yeah,
and I know Pan Am at one point was catered by a French, like Maxim.
Yeah, they devised the menus with Maxims of Paris.
Right. I remember that. I mean, I knew that.
Yeah.
Sandy, you're back. Do you have questions?
I am. I do have questions. Well, our audience has questions.
Okay.
One question, which I thought was kind of interesting, is, Julia, did you ever discover any of the stewardesses you talked to that became pilots, or hear about any of them that did?
I heard about some. None of the women that I talked to. That was a little bit. That would have been after their time. Because they had all started flying in the 60s. So, I don't think that women didn't start really doing that in larger numbers until a fair bit afterwards.
Yeah, according to Patricia, it's a fairly small percentage of the pilots are women, and
very
just wondering. Small. And then another question was, was it weird for either of you when you fly a different airline? Do you constantly notice the difference between that airline and either TWA or Pan Am?
That's got to be a question for Anne, because I was only 9 when Pan Am went under, so I am not.
I'll even go a step further in that question, Sandy. First of all, when TWA existed and I flew with them, I didn't think anybody did anything as well as TWA did. I was so proud of my company. But now, flying and airlines have changed so much that I'm just forever. Anybody I'm flying with, I drive them crazy because I'm forever saying, I can't believe they're picking up trash with a trash bag in the aisle, or they didn't check if our tray tables were up. I drive them crazy. So it's sort of, once you're a flight attendant,
I'd fly with you, Anne. I would fly with you. Don't worry.
Look at the way they put this napkin down. This is disgusting. I'm terrible.
One of the Debbie Taylor said that I guess she or someone she knew flew United, and said that United had girdle checks before their flight. Do you remember anything about that? to check them
Yeah.
out. I remember that from when I remember that when I was younger, that women always wore them, and
Yeah.
and when you think about how far women have come, I think you don't need to look any further than stewardesses and flight attendants to see.
I'm sure, Julia, that the women you spoke to not only had to wear girdles, but gloves.
Yes, they did.
And hats.
Yeah. They did until suddenly they didn't. But the hats and gloves were always, it was to them a mark of the formality of what they were doing on some level. There were women who, especially like in Vietnam, when they would go, a lot of the women would go and visit with the soldiers in the air bases and these were men who, there were wounded men among them. There were, men suffering from PTSD. They felt very strongly that, putting on the hat and gloves implied a level of, it conferred dignity not only on them, but on whoever they were interacting with also.
Yeah.
So Tom Bedell had a question here, which I think answered something you were talking about. The first African-American stewardess, her name was Ruth Carroll Taylor.
Yes,
That's right.
that was her name. I posted a picture of her on Instagram like 3 months ago. The ebony cover.
That's right. Yeah.
So Susan Eastman wants to know that flying was once so luxurious, it was a few hours of magic. Why did that change, and in what ways do you think it's changed?
Well, so on a macro level, the reason why that changed is because of deregulation. So back in the 60s and early 70s, airlines could not compete via prices. The prices were fixed by the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board. And so the airlines competed via perks and luxury and image. So like it was an active game of one-upsmanship, who could give you the best service. Now they don't compete. Now they compete via prices. So it's the cost of our having cheap airfare. This is the thing. Like when my friends complain about how not fun flying is, I'm like, well, what do you expect? If you're getting a ticket for like $400 to cross the country, that's 3,000 miles.
Yeah.
Like that's what do you expect? You don't get to have it all.
I think before deregulation, a ticket to LA from New York, you couldn't get one for under $1,400.
Yeah. And that was back then.
Yeah. And deregulation started in 78, I think. So
yeah.
And
it ruined everything.
Susan Eastman said that she missed what you said that was called when families could fly.
Non-revving, yeah.
Non-revving?
Yeah, like non-revenue.
Revenue.
Oh, got it. Okay.
It's called non-rev.
Okay. And then we have a retired stewardess here who flew for United for 43 years, Debbie Taylor. That's a nice long run.
Yeah. That's amazing.
I think in terms of, hearing the stories about these women and knowing that they, from all perspectives, a lot of them are much more qualified than some of the people that run our country. I think that it's astonishing. It's astonishing to think. I mean, when I got out of high school, I dreamed about being a stewardess, but there was no way because number one, I'm 5'2", and so I was never tall enough, and that wasn't going to change. And even after college, I had the languages, but I still wasn't tall enough. So there you go. Anyway, but it would have been so fun to travel, and I think people who maybe took that on as a job, they didn't just want the education, but they wanted to see the world. They wanted to really get out and be a part of the world and make a difference, and not just stay in their hometown and raise babies or whatever. So yeah. I think that there was a lot of motivation.
No, you're actually right, because you're 100%. Almost every single woman I have ever interviewed who flew in that era answered with that exact phrase. When I said, why did you start flying for Pan Am? And they always said the same answer it was a variation on, I wanted to see the world. Mm-hmm. Which I think is hugely politically important, for women of that generation. That's part of why I wanted to write this book, that, their desire to see the world changed the world. Their determination to put that desire in front of, and it's a sense of, the social obligation to get married or, whatever else. It really, it paved the way for the kind of freedoms that my generation of women are able to experience.
Yeah, and I think it's to their credit that they didn't see their job as being sort of, denigrating to women, that they took pride in it and they did what they did, and they didn't say, gee, why do I have to have a college education and be a certain height and weight and be unmarried to pick up paper cups, whatever.
Sandy, that is so important what you
Mhm.
just said, because I thought being a flight attendant was being a powerful woman.
Yeah.
I never once, and people would say, not nicely, obviously, oh, you're just a glorified waitress. And I thought, boy, are you wrong?
Yep.
I think that the women who choose to become flight attendants are anything but women who are insecure or uncomfortable with their femininity or don't see power in being a woman.
Right, exactly.
The opposite.
or who are unable to see that femininity and empowerment can go in the same, that they don't have to
Absolutely.
sacrifice. To me, they really seemed like third wave. Like if we're talking about like the waves of feminism, right? They seemed like my generation of feminist who is like, yeah, I'm gonna wear my lipstick and I'm gonna beat you out for that job at the same time. Thank
Right.
you.
Yeah.
So it who didn't have to sacrifice, whereas a lot of the women of that generation, I think, really felt very strong and felt that pressure to not wear the lipstick maybe if they wanted to get that job or whatever. I'm not a part of that, but
Yeah, they didn't feel like they needed to stand on their feminism, that they had
yeah,
their own power.
they were much more subtle
Mhm.
about that empowerment, which I
Yeah,
found.
they knew that they had their own power because they were smart and they were prepared, and they were the person who could do it and be the right person.
Yeah,
And
I
they're
like
so
I like what you said, Julia, about you were listing many of the qualities necessary
Mhm.
to be a flight attendant. And one of the ones you said was you have to think on your feet. And I love that you said that, because for so many different reasons, dealing with passengers or your short meals, but also to get people off an airplane in an emergency.
absolutely.
And we forget that that's actually why we're on that plane.
I gave a talk this week to the Aero Club in DC, and that was one of the things that that the group kind of hit on, is that people forget that there are still so many things that can go wrong in the air. There were even more back then.
Yes.
Now, it's still like, if you're getting we forget that the goal is safety, to get you from point A to point B without, and think about the mayhem of 300 odd passengers and all of their different circumstances and, the different pressures that they're under, and their different fears and their health conditions. And there are so many things that can go wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that a number of people also commented on the uniforms, the spectator pumps and their little caps, and the travel bags for the airlines, and you don't see those anymore. But I remember there used to always be a travel bags that were available either for purchase or maybe they were given to, I don't know where they came from, but they had the airline logo on them, like a little overnight bag.
Yep.
You don't see those anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that there were a lot of sort of props, and thank you for your props, Anne. That was so fun.
I know.
Oh my gosh, I know. I love the photos of you as a stewardess.
Yeah, they're funny, aren't they? Yeah, I was remembering with my old roommate that we actually had stationery, TWA stationery, and people would ask, like, I'd like to write a letter, and you'd bring out this leather portfolio.
Wow.
That had paper with the TWA logo and envelope.
Wow.
The TWA logo and TWA pens, and then they would give you the letters to mail.
It was a very slow texting.
Wouldn't you love to have one of those?
I know. I have a deck of playing cards someone had and gave me, so I've got TWA playing cards.
Yeah, I'll have to be on the lookout for that. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Letter portfolio with stationery.
Yeah, with the stationery in it. Funny.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think that definitely. I mean, it must have been. It would be interesting to know, and I don't know. It's after your era, Julia, but it'd be interesting to know how male flight attendants integrated into the all-female world, previous world of stewardess.
From the women's perspectives, they I had thought that a bunch of them would find the incursion of men to be a little bit frustrating, because they had really, a lot of these women. Lynn, one of the primary women in my book, she had been a biology major at SUNY Oswego. She had been in labs. She'd done a lot of lab work in college, and she was always the only woman or one of two in these labs. And so I think that sense of, she wouldn't have phrased it quite so overtly, but that sense of alienation or intimidation in that very male context, I think is part of what propelled her into being a stewardess. She wanted to see the world, but I think she was really excited to be chosen for her femininity, not in spite of her femininity. And I would have thought that they would have had some kind of misgivings about the men, but none of them. I never heard any expression of any of that.
Julia, did TWA always had male pursers on international flights long before men were flight attendants? So the women were used to having at least male on their crew, and of course, the purser was in charge of service. So actually, he was sort of the boss, really. But he was
Pan Am had women pursers.
Okay.
So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the male ones. As you mentioned it, I'd forgotten about that.
Yep.
Unbelievable. Years of flying, so many stories.
It's funny. My friend Matt, who's the one who went on to fly after TWA closed, he went on to fly for American. In 1977 or 78, he was in college and he took a flight and he was shocked that men were flight attendants. He had no idea. And he said,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, there were 2 male flight attendants. It was a flight like to Miami or something. And he said, how do you like this job? And they're like, it's the best job in the world. And that's why he applied. But he didn't know men were flight attendants. And that was like in 1978.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, guys. This has been so great. I loved hearing these stories because I've flown all through those years, and it's been an experience, and it certainly has changed. It's not nearly as much fun as it used to be.
Julia, thank you for writing a book that celebrates these special women and this airline Pan Am, which nobody has the pleasure and joy of flying anymore. But thank you so much. It's such an important story, and I'm so glad you told it.
Well, thank you for having me to talk about it. I really appreciate this. And so it's been, I feel like we could talk for many more hours.
Yeah.
So on Friday, May 14th, we'll continue our travel fantasy with fiction writers Claire Lombardo in conversation with Kate Russo and her book Superhost, which is an entertaining look at what happens when a 55-year-old artist whose wife has left him and whose career is faltering is forced to move into his artist studio behind his West London home and rent his home to vacationers through a popular Airbnb type website. So this is Kate Russo's debut novel, but she's from a family of writers. And Claire Lombardo is the debut author, New York Times bestselling author of The Most Fun We Ever Had. 2021 marks our 20th anniversary season, which will be full of special events like this one, and will culminate in a stellar 20th anniversary festival, which we believe now is going to be live. And Amtrak has announced that they're going to start trains back up mid-July. Yay!
Wow.
So that's exciting. It's exciting for you too, Julia, right? Does the train?
So yeah, the train it goes to Rutland.
Yeah.
That's the express to New York, which I used to take a lot.
Yeah, July 19th. Put it on your calendar.
Wow.
And so if you could donate this year, please consider and do so. And thank you for your support and for being such a fun and fabulous audience. We could not do this without you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Sandy, for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.